That shot can't be made. Colonel Daniel Hayes rarely used the word impossible. In 26 years with the Navy SEALs, he had led missions across deserts, mountains, and coastlines that most Americans would never see on a map. He had watched operators overcome equipment failures, weather disasters, and impossible timelines. But on that cold morning at Forward Operating Base Redstone, he stood in front of a wall-sized digital map and said the words anyway. It's impossible. The operations center fell silent. No one challenged him. No one even looked surprised. Outside, the early sunlight stretched across the rocky ridges of eastern Nevada, turning the distant mountains gold. Inside, dozens of military personnel stared at screens filled with surveillance feeds, terrain models, and weather reports. The problem in front of them had consumed the base for nearly 3 days. Every expert who had studied it had reached the same conclusion. There was no solution. Colonel Hayes crossed his arms and looked again at the highlighted section of terrain displayed on the screen. A narrow canyon, a maze of cliffs, sharp elevation changes, unpredictable wind currents. The kind of environment that turns simple calculations into impossible puzzles. Several reconnaissance teams had spent hours collecting data. Analysts had reviewed every available image. Experienced marksmen had run calculations over and over again. Every result ended in failure. Distance? Hayes asked. 2,681 yards, sir. An intelligence officer answered immediately. Hayes nodded. The room remained tense. Everyone understood what that number meant. It wasn't just the distance. It was everything surrounding it. The terrain, the angles, the shifting winds, the narrow line of sight, the tiny margin for error. Even the most experienced shooters in the room avoided eye contact. Near the back wall, 3 sniper team leaders stood beside a table covered in printed reports. They had already spent most of the night analyzing the situation. None of them looked confident anymore. One finally shook his head. I've never seen conditions like this. Another exhaled slowly. Neither have I. The third simply stared at the map without speaking. The atmosphere felt heavy. Not because anyone lacked skill. Quite the opposite. The people inside that room were among the most capable military professionals in the country. If they were struggling, the problem truly was extraordinary. Hayes stepped closer to the display. Every option, he asked. Reviewed twice, sir. And the analyst hesitated. No viable solution. The colonel looked away from the screen. For a moment, the room seemed frozen in place. Computer fans hummed softly. Keyboards clicked somewhere in the background. A radio transmission crackled and disappeared. Then Hayes rubbed his forehead and spoke the words again, this time even quieter. It's impossible. Nobody noticed the woman sitting near the far corner of the room. Staff Sergeant Emily Carter sat alone beside a stack of equipment cases, a notebook resting on her knee. She wore the same camouflage uniform as everyone else. No medals on display. No dramatic entrance. No attempt to draw attention. Most people in the room probably couldn't have recalled seeing her enter. She listened quietly while the discussion continued around her. Her blue eyes occasionally drifted toward the giant map on the wall, then back to the weather data, then to a set of satellite images no one else seemed interested in. While the room searched for answers, Emily Carter remained silent. And somewhere deep inside the operations center, hidden beneath layers of frustration and doubt, the first clue to solving the impossible was waiting to be noticed. Colonel Hayes remained at the front of the operations center while the analysts continued reviewing data that had already been reviewed a dozen times. The giant display shifted between topographical maps, weather models, and satellite imagery. Every new screen seemed to lead back to the same conclusion. The canyon offered no clear solution. The target area sat in one of the most difficult environments anyone on the base had ever studied. Steep rock walls created unpredictable air currents. Temperature changes altered wind behavior from minute to minute. Even the most advanced software struggled to predict what conditions would look like 10 seconds into the future. Lieutenant Ryan Mercer stepped forward and enlarged a section of the map. We have confirmed the location, he said, at least within a small margin of error. Hayes looked up. How small? Mercer hesitated. About 40 yards, sir. Several officers exchanged frustrated glances. 40 yards might not sound like much to an outsider, but at that distance it represented a massive uncertainty. The room understood the problem immediately. One analyst leaned back in his chair and sighed. It may as well be 100. Nobody disagreed. The discussion continued as teams searched for alternatives. Some proposed waiting for different weather conditions. Others suggested moving equipment to another observation point. Each option was quickly eliminated. Time worked against them. Conditions would only become more complicated as the day progressed. Near the rear of the room, Emily Carter quietly studied a series of weather reports displayed on a secondary monitor. Unlike everyone else, she was not focused on the primary target location. Her attention kept drifting toward the surrounding terrain. A young communications specialist noticed her reviewing the data and smiled politely. Looking for something specific? Emily glanced at the screen. Maybe. The specialist nodded awkwardly and returned to work. Emily said nothing more. Across the room, 3 experienced sniper team leaders compared calculations. Captain Andrew Collins shook his head. The wind shifts are too aggressive. Another sniper, Master Sergeant Ethan Brooks, pointed toward the canyon. Even if somebody made the shot, there is no way to guarantee consistency. Hayes listened carefully. These were men whose opinions carried weight. Neither had a reputation for exaggeration. If they were doubtful, the challenge truly deserved respect. A few moments later, a new satellite image appeared on the main display. Mercer zoomed in. This was captured 7 minutes ago. Everyone leaned forward. The image showed the canyon from above. Jagged ridges stretched across the landscape like scars carved into stone. Hayes narrowed his eyes. Anything new? Not that we can confirm. The room settled back into silence. Emily continued watching. Unlike the others, she was not studying the obvious features. Her attention locked onto a narrow section of rock near the edge of the image. For less than a second, something seemed unusual. She leaned closer. Then the image disappeared as another report replaced it. Emily remained still. Her expression never changed. Around her, conversations resumed. Analysts debated numbers. Officers reviewed possibilities. Experts searched for answers. Yet Emily could not stop thinking about the tiny detail she had just seen. It was small enough that most people would dismiss it instantly. In fact, everyone already had. But something about it felt wrong. And for the first time since entering the operations center, she reached for a pen and began writing notes. The operations center grew busier as the morning progressed. Fresh reports arrived every few minutes. Weather data updated constantly. Analysts moved between workstations carrying tablets and printed maps. Yet despite all the activity, nobody was any closer to solving the problem. Colonel Hayes stood beside the main display while Captain Andrew Collins reviewed another set of calculations. The results looked no better than the previous ones. Collins lowered the tablet and exhaled slowly. I have checked it 3 times. Hayes already knew the answer before he asked. And same conclusion. Hayes nodded. Around the room, several officers exchanged weary looks. The challenge had become the center of attention for the entire base. Every available expert had been consulted. Every realistic approach had been examined. The answer never changed. Master Sergeant Ethan Brooks stepped toward the screen and highlighted a series of wind measurements collected during the previous 12 hours. This is the real problem, he explained. The wind is not moving in one direction. It is bouncing between the canyon walls. Several younger operators watched carefully. Brooks pointed toward the terrain model. At one moment it pushes left. 30 seconds later it shifts right. Then it drops completely. There is no consistent pattern. A lieutenant near the back of the room folded his arms. Could we wait for calmer conditions? Brooks shook his head immediately. We have already reviewed that possibility. The canyon creates its own weather effects. Calm conditions outside do not guarantee calm conditions inside. The room fell quiet again. Nobody enjoyed hearing that answer. Meanwhile, Emily Carter continued reviewing the satellite archive. She had requested access to every image collected during the previous 72 hours. Hundreds of photographs filled her screen. Most appeared identical at first glance. Rock formations, shadows, dust, sunlight. Nothing unusual. Yet Emily continued studying them one by one. Her notebook slowly filled with observations. Timestamps, angles, light conditions, tiny details that nobody else seemed interested in tracking. A young analyst named Trevor Lewis noticed her work and walked over. You are still looking at those images? Emily nodded. Yes. Trevor glanced at the screen. The intelligence team already cleared them. I know. Then what are you looking for? Emily studied one photograph for several seconds before answering. something everyone dismissed. Trevor laughed politely. That narrows it down. Emily offered the faintest smile before returning to the screen. Trevor eventually walked away. Across the room, another discussion was beginning. This time the focus shifted toward equipment. Some officers wondered if newer optics or different rifle platforms could improve the odds. The debate lasted nearly 20 minutes. In the end, nobody could support the idea. The issue was never the equipment. The issue was the environment itself. Hayes listened quietly before ending the discussion. Enough, he said. We are chasing the same answers. Nobody argued. The colonel was right. Then something caught Emily's attention. She froze. One of the archived images displayed a brief reflection near the edge of a rock formation. She immediately opened another image taken 6 minutes later. The reflection was gone. She compared a third image. Gone again. A fourth image. There it was. Very small. Barely visible. Most people would never notice it. Emily leaned closer. For the first time. All morning, she stopped taking notes. Her eyes remained fixed on the screen as a new possibility began forming in her mind. Emily enlarged the image and studied the reflection again. It appeared for less than a second in the archived sequence, then disappeared entirely. To most people it looked meaningless, nothing more than sunlight striking a random surface inside the canyon. But the more she examined it, the less random it seemed. She opened 6 additional images taken throughout the morning. The reflection appeared twice more. Not in the same place, but close enough to suggest a pattern. Emily compared the timestamps and began writing numbers in her notebook. Across the operations center, Colonel Hayes listened as another team presented their final assessment. The conclusion sounded painfully familiar. There is simply too much uncertainty, Captain Collins said. The distance alone creates problems. Add the terrain and the shifting air currents, and the margin for error becomes unacceptable. Hayes nodded slowly. What about alternative observation points? Already reviewed. Equipment changes? Reviewed. Different calculations? Collins gave a tired smile. Reviewed 3 times. A few people chuckled quietly, but the humor vanished almost immediately. Nobody felt optimistic anymore. Master Sergeant Brooks stepped forward next. Unlike Collins, he spoke with the confidence of someone who had spent decades behind precision optics. Sir, I want to be clear about something. Hayes looked at him. Go ahead. Brooks pointed toward the canyon displayed on the screen. This is not a question of skill. It is not a question of training. It is not a question of equipment. Every sniper on this base could spend the next month studying these conditions and reach the same answer. He paused before finishing. Sometimes the environment wins. The room fell silent. Coming from Brooks, those words carried enormous weight. Younger operators exchanged uneasy glances. They respected him because he rarely admitted defeat. Hayes folded his arms. So your professional opinion is that nobody can solve this? Brooks did not hesitate. Yes, sir. Several heads nodded. Another. Sniper team leader agreed immediately. Then another. One after another, experienced professionals reached the same conclusion. Emily listened quietly from the corner. She never interrupted. She never challenged anyone. Instead, she continued comparing photographs. The reflection appeared again. This time she noticed something new. It was not simply appearing and disappearing. It was appearing at nearly identical intervals. Her pen stopped moving. Emily checked the timestamps again. Then again, a pattern emerged. Small, subtle, easy to overlook. Yet once she saw it, she could not unsee it. The reflection was not random. Something was causing it. Something predictable. Trevor Lewis walked past her desk and noticed the sudden change in her expression. You found something? Emily remained focused on the screen. Maybe. Trevor laughed. You have been saying maybe all morning. Emily zoomed further into the image. This time I mean it. Nearby, the discussion among the experts continued. More data. More calculations. More reasons why success was impossible. Yet for the first time that day, Emily Carter was no longer listening to what everyone believed could not be done. She was focused on a much smaller question. Why did that reflection keep returning at exactly the moments everyone else ignored? Emily reviewed the timestamps one more time before standing from her chair. Around her, the operations center continued moving through the same cycle of reports, calculations, and dead ends. Nobody paid much attention as she walked toward an empty workstation closer to the main display. She connected her tablet and began pulling satellite images onto a larger monitor. Within seconds, several analysts noticed. Trevor Lewis was the first to approach. What are you doing? Emily kept her eyes on the screen, checking a theory. Trevor glanced at the images. About the reflection? Emily nodded. A few nearby operators overheard the conversation. One of them leaned closer. You found something? Emily did not answer immediately. Instead, she overlaid 4 separate images captured at different times throughout the morning. The reflections appeared in each one. Small flashes of light. Easy to miss. Easy to dismiss. Yet when the images were synchronized, a pattern emerged. Trevor frowned. That cannot be a coincidence. Emily finally looked up. I do not think it is. Before Trevor could respond, Colonel Hayes noticed the growing crowd around her workstation. He stepped away from the main display and approached. The room gradually quieted. Hayes looked at the screen, then at Emily. What do you have? Emily straightened slightly. Sir, I think everyone has been studying the wrong problem. Several officers exchanged skeptical looks. Hayes folded his arms. Explain. Emily pointed toward the canyon images. Everyone has been trying to solve the environmental conditions. Because they are the problem. Part of the problem, Emily replied calmly. Not the whole problem. Hayes remained silent. Emily enlarged one of the reflections. This appears every 19 to 21 minutes. Trevor nodded. We checked that. Emily switched to another image. The location shifts slightly every time. Hayes studied the display. Meaning something is creating the reflection. One of the analysts shook his head. Sunlight reflects off rocks all the time. Emily nodded. Normally, yes. She opened another image. Then another. Then another. But rocks do not move. The room became noticeably quieter. Hayes leaned closer. You are saying this is connected? I believe so. A captain near the back crossed his arms. That is a very thin theory. Emily accepted the criticism without reacting. Maybe. She pulled up terrain data beside the images. But every calculation assumes the position is fixed. Nobody spoke. Emily pointed toward the reflection sequence. If the position is changing slightly, then the calculations are wrong before they even begin. Trevor stared at the screen. Slowly, realization appeared on his face. Hayes looked between the images and the terrain map. For the first time all day, uncertainty entered his expression. Not uncertainty about the challenge. Uncertainty about the assumptions behind it. Emily opened her notebook and turned it toward him. Several pages were filled with numbers, time intervals, and observations. I think everyone has been looking at where the problem is. Hayes studied the notes. And Emily met his eyes. I think we need to start looking at when it appears. For several seconds, nobody spoke. The operations center remained completely still as Colonel Hayes studied the notes Emily had placed in front of him. Around them, dozens of professionals waited to see what would happen next. Most had spent the better part of 3 days attacking the problem from every possible angle. Now a staff sergeant who had barely spoken all morning was suggesting that the entire approach had been wrong from the beginning. Captain Collins finally broke the silence. You are telling us that timing matters more than location? Emily nodded. I think they are connected. Collins looked unconvinced. Based on a reflection? Based on a pattern. Master Sergeant Brooks stepped closer to the monitor. He was one of the most respected marksmen on the base, and unlike some of the others, he seemed genuinely curious. Show me. Emily enlarged the images and displayed them side by side. These were captured over 72 hours. She highlighted each reflection. The intervals are remarkably consistent. Brooks narrowed his eyes. 19 to 21 minutes. Yes. That should not happen naturally. Emily nodded. Exactly. Trevor Lewis looked around the room. So if the pattern is real, what does it mean? Emily switched to a terrain model. I think something becomes visible for a very short period of time. Hayes studied the screen. How short? Less than 4 seconds. Several people immediately reacted. One officer laughed quietly. For seconds. Another shook his head. That changes nothing. Emily remained calm. Maybe. The officer crossed his arms. Maybe. Emily looked directly at him. If you were studying a 12-hour weather cycle, for seconds means nothing. She paused. If you are waiting for a specific opportunity, for seconds means everything. The room grew quiet again. Hayes continued watching her carefully. For the first time all day, he was no longer dismissing the possibility. He was testing it. What are you asking for? Emily answered immediately. The complete wind archive. Collins frowned. You already have most of it. Not all of it. Hayes looked toward the weather team. Get her everything. Several officers exchanged surprised glances. The order came without hesitation. Within minutes, additional data appeared on Emily's workstation. Wind speed, wind direction, temperature shifts, pressure changes. Tens of thousands of measurements collected from sensors across the canyon. Emily began reviewing them immediately. Her fingers moved steadily across the keyboard. Numbers filled the screen. Graphs appeared, disappeared, reappeared. Nearly 20 minutes passed. Nobody interrupted her. Even the skeptics watched now. Finally, Emily stopped. Her eyes remained fixed on the display. Trevor noticed first. What did you find? Emily pointed toward a narrow section of the graph. There. Hayes stepped closer. Explain. Emily enlarged the chart. Every time the reflection appears, the wind behaves differently. Brooks studied the data. Then his expression changed. Wait. Emily nodded. That is what I thought. Brooks leaned toward the monitor. There is a gap. Yes. A very small one. Emily looked at Hayes. A brief window when the crosswinds almost disappear. Nobody said a word. Brooks slowly straightened. After several seconds, he spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. I have never seen anything like that before. The moment Brooks said it, the atmosphere inside the operations center changed. For the first time since the problem had arrived on their desks, nobody was talking about why it could not be solved. They were talking about a possibility. Small, fragile, difficult, but real. Colonel Hayes stared at the graph displayed on Emily's monitor. The narrow opening in the wind data lasted only seconds before the canyon returned to its usual chaos. Every expert in the room understood what that meant. The challenge had not disappeared. If anything, it had become even more demanding. Success would depend on recognizing a window that appeared briefly and vanished just as quickly. Hayes looked toward Brooks. Could somebody use it? Brooks remained silent for several seconds. His eyes never left the screen. In theory, a few officers immediately focused on that answer. In theory was not the same as yes. Captain Collins folded his arms. And in reality, Brooks slowly shook his head. The timing would have to be perfect. Emily continued studying the data. Not perfect. Brooks glanced toward her. Close enough that most people would call it perfect. A faint smile appeared on Emily's face. The room noticed. Hayes noticed too. You disagree? Emily looked at the graph. I think everyone is still looking at the wrong part. Several heads turned toward her again. Hayes gestured toward the screen. Show us. Emily opened another file and overlaid the reflection pattern with the wind measurements. Then she added satellite timestamps. A new set of lines appeared. At first they looked random. Then the relationship became obvious. Trevor Lewis leaned forward. Wait. Emily highlighted several points. The reflection does not happen during the wind gap. Confusion spread across the room. Collins frowned. Then what are we looking at? Emily zoomed in further. It happens immediately before it. Brooks stared at the display. Then his eyes widened slightly. A marker. Emily nodded. Exactly. Nobody spoke. The realization moved through the room one person at a time. The reflection was not merely a clue. It was a warning. A signal that the brief environmental shift was about to occur. Hayes stepped closer. How much time? Emily checked her calculations. Approximately 3.5 seconds. Trevor let out a low whistle. Collins shook his head. That is not enough. Emily calmly met his gaze. It is if you already know it is coming. The room fell silent again. Hayes looked from the screen to Emily. You are saying the reflection predicts the opening? Yes, sir. And you are confident? Emily glanced back at her notebook. Every calculation, every image, every timestamp, everything pointed to the same answer. Yes, sir. Brooks slowly exhaled. If she is right, then the canyon is not random. Nobody had considered that possibility before. For 3 days they had treated the environment as an unpredictable obstacle. Emily had found evidence that it followed a pattern. Difficult to see, easy to miss, but a pattern nonetheless. Hayes looked around the room. The skepticism that had dominated every conversation was fading. Curiosity had replaced it. Hope was beginning to replace frustration. Then the colonel turned back toward Emily Carter. If the opportunity is real, he said quietly, what happens when those 3.5 seconds arrive? Emily closed her notebook and finally looked up from the data. Then somebody has to be ready. The operations center moved with a new sense of urgency. For the first time in 3 days, Every conversation pointed toward a possible solution instead of another obstacle. Analysts updated weather models in real time. Satellite feeds refreshed continuously. Teams compared data sets that had previously seemed unrelated. At the center of it all stood Emily Carter, quietly reviewing the final calculations. She never acted like someone carrying the weight of the room's expectations. She simply focused on the numbers. Colonel Hayes watched from across the operations center. Earlier that morning, he had been prepared to accept that the challenge could not be solved. Now he found himself checking his watch every few minutes. According to Emily's calculations, the next opportunity would appear soon. Captain Collins stood beside the main display studying the countdown timer. 7 minutes, he said. Nobody responded. Every person in the room already knew. The atmosphere felt different now. Not relaxed. Not confident. Focused. The giant display showed live weather readings flowing across the canyon. Wind speed shifted constantly. Air currents twisted through the terrain exactly as they always had. To anyone unfamiliar with Emily's discovery, the conditions still appeared impossible. Trevor Lewis glanced toward her workstation. Are you sure the pattern will repeat? Emily looked at the latest data. It already is. Trevor followed her gaze. Slowly, he nodded. The indicators were beginning to align. The same sequence. The same environmental shifts. The same subtle signs that had appeared in the archived images. Colonel Hayes approached her position. What do you need? Emily answered without hesitation. Nothing, sir. Hayes raised an eyebrow. Nothing. Everything we need is already here. Several nearby officers exchanged surprised looks. They were accustomed to requests for more equipment, more personnel, more resources. Emily wanted none of those things. She wanted timing. The countdown continued. 5 minutes. 4. 3. The room grew quieter with each passing second. Brooks studied the live weather feed while Collins monitored the satellite imagery. Trevor tracked the timestamps. Nobody wanted to miss the signal. Then it happened. A technician near the front pointed toward the display. There. Every head turned. A brief flash appeared near the edge of the canyon image. Small, fleeting, easy to overlook. Yet this time everyone recognized it immediately. The reflection, exactly where Emily predicted it would appear. Trevor stared at the screen. Unbelievable. Collins checked the clock. 3.5 seconds. Emily was already working. Her eyes moved between the reflection, the wind data, and the terrain model. Calm, precise, focused. Around her, experienced officers watched in complete silence. The reflection vanished. Seconds later, the wind readings changed. Not dramatically, just enough. The narrow opening Emily had discovered appeared exactly on schedule. Brooks looked at the numbers and slowly shook his head in disbelief. She was right. No one argued. No one questioned the data anymore. The impossible challenge that had frustrated an entire base was suddenly behaving exactly as Emily Carter predicted. And as the room absorbed what they had just witnessed, Colonel Hayes realized something far more important than the pattern itself. The answer had been sitting quietly in the corner all morning, and almost nobody had noticed. The room remained silent long after the reflection disappeared from the screen. Nobody rushed to speak. Nobody rushed to celebrate. The people inside the operations center understood exactly what they had witnessed. For 3 days, experienced officers, analysts, and specialists had examined the problem from every possible angle. They had questioned the equipment, the terrain, the weather, and their own calculations. Yet, the breakthrough had come from a detail so small that nearly everyone had ignored it. Colonel Hayes slowly looked around the room. The frustration that had dominated the previous 72 hours was gone. In its place stood something much rarer. Respect. Not the kind that came from rank or authority. The kind that came from competence. Trevor Lewis finally broke the silence. You saw it before any of us. Emily glanced at the monitor. The clue was there the whole time. Trevor laughed softly. Maybe, but nobody else found it. Several analysts nodded in agreement. Collins folded his arms and looked toward the weather display once more. We spent days trying to force an answer. Emily closed her notebook. Sometimes the answer is already there. Brooks smiled. You just have to know where to look. The comment earned a few quiet laughs. For the first time all day, the tension inside the room eased. Colonel Hayes turned toward the personnel terminal near the wall. A thought had been bothering him ever since Emily's theory proved correct. He entered her name into the system and opened her service record. At first, he expected to find a standard file. Instead, his expression changed. Collins noticed immediately. Something wrong. Hayes did not answer. He continued reading. Training certifications. Specialized assignments. Advanced marksmanship qualifications. Recognition from units across multiple commands. The deeper he looked, the more surprised he became. Brooks stepped closer. Sir. Hayes slowly turned the monitor toward him. Brooks read the file and immediately understood. Well, he said quietly, that explains a few things. Trevor looked between them. What? Hayes shook his head in disbelief. She never mentioned any of this. Emily looked genuinely confused. Mention what? Hayes met her eyes. Most people would have introduced themselves with this record. Emily shrugged. Nobody asked. The room laughed. Even Hayes smiled. It was such a simple answer that nobody knew how to respond. The colonel closed the file and looked around the operations center. Earlier that morning, people had overlooked Emily because she sat quietly in the corner and never demanded attention. Now every person in the room understood the same lesson. Ability does not always announce itself. Expertise does not always arrive with a speech. Sometimes the most capable person in the room is the one listening instead of talking. Hayes extended his hand. Outstanding work, Staff Sergeant Carter. Emily shook it politely. Thank you, sir. There was no dramatic speech. No victory lap. No attempt to draw attention to herself. A few minutes later, she gathered her notebook, organized her papers, and prepared to leave. As she walked toward the exit, conversations resumed behind her. Analysts returned to their stations. Officers reviewed new reports. The mission moved forward. Yet something inside the operations center had changed. People no longer remembered the problem as the challenge that could not be solved. They remembered the quiet woman who noticed what everyone else missed. And long after Emily Carter disappeared down the hallway, Colonel Hayes found himself looking once more at the empty chair in the corner of the room, thinking about how close they had come to overlooking the very person who held the answer all along.